So good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you. I know that we're all incredibly busy during this time, and for you to take 90 minutes to spend with me, I have great amount of gratitude. I hope that this information will help. Many, as we know, counties and state agencies are looking at now reentry, a return to work, given a lot of the, given the pandemic. And some of the issues that are coming up are as many of you already know, are incredibly complex. So I wanted to have a chance to talk with you today about not only, the agenda is not only sort of some of the complexities, but also how do you manage this time when you're looking at a situation that we've just never been in before. So how do we manage something that, from a leading perspective, from a leader perspective, that is new for all of us? And what's really interesting to me about this time, I don't know if you guys will agree or disagree, but what's really fascinating to me about this time is that I'm not able to necessarily use some of my backwards experience, right? My previous experience to actually inform as well as I'm used to my future experience. So we'll see what you think as we go on. I want us to start out in thinking in terms of phases of this pandemic. We all know that there was an impact and there still is an impact. So the first phase really has been an impact, right? The second phase, though, has also, and while there was still impact, was adaptivity. So many of us initially, I don't know if you guys felt this way, I know I did, I was in shock for like several weeks. I was absolutely in shock and some level of denial. It just did not compute for me, all that was going on, until I slowly was be able to adapt to and kind of move and become a little more fluid around some of these issues. So that is the second stage. The third stage, which we are also now in, besides being adaptive, which excites me, is the innovation stage. And those of you who understand public service in the way I understand public service, even though I'm on the outside of there, is that there is not necessarily a lot of innovation. That doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of functionality. It doesn't mean that there aren't wonderful, wonderful workplaces, but innovation is not always in the forefront. And yet this is a time where we can look at innovation. We can change our cultures, our agency cultures, in a way probably today that we might not have been able to before. So also going to address some of the psychological and social challenges around reentry. Of course, those of you who know me know that I speak from the social neurosciences, so I'm going to talk about the brain. I'm going to talk about what it is in terms of communications, the collaboration, the cooperation. How is it that we can lead those staff of ours, our colleagues, toward both well-being as well as post-traumatic growth? Now, many of you might know the term post-traumatic growth. I'm going to define it for you in a very layperson's way. Post-traumatic growth basically is this: if bad things have to happen to us, can we actually grow as individuals? But here's the other thing: if bad things have to happen to our agencies, can we grow as agencies as well? Can we actually see post-traumatic growth in our agencies? And so that we'll be talking about. And then, of course, becoming workforce trauma informed. For those of you that know me, you know that I work on a national initiative called Igniting the Potential. It's out of Washington, D.C., and it is all about health and human service professionals and looking at workforce well-being specifically and their health. So we're going to talk about what does it mean to become workforce trauma informed in a reentry perspective. I'm going to first start, please, with a polling question, though. Don't mind, Georgia. I just want to know who is all here and what your roles are. So what is your role in the organization? Supervisor, line staff, manager, deputy, director, CAO, elected officials. And would you mind putting it up, Georgia? Thank you so much. And if you don't mind, guys, just give me some answers so I have an understanding, because then it will allow me and inform me to be able to it'll allow me to be able to sort of center some of my information with you. So far we're looking at 39% are supervisors, 28% are managers. I've got 18% are line staff, some deputies, have some directors and CAOs. Fantastic, fantastic. Can I have a few more of you answer if you don't mind? Perfect. We're up to 80%. That's fine. You can give another 10 seconds, and then we can stop the poll. Great. Let's end the poll. Thank you. So you can just see sort of who is all in the room today, or in your rooms today, I should say, and what is some of the areas that we're going to address will directly involve those of you that manage or supervise others. Okay, so you'll know that. So I want us to talk for a moment about sort of everyone is talking about flattening the curve, right? We hear it over and over again. You know, the curve is flattening, the curve isn't flattening, but the goal is to flatten the virus curve. Well, the pieces that I'm going to talk about today is how do we flatten the psychological curve? Because one of the issues that we now understand, I'm both a clinical and an organizational psychologist. So from a clinical hat, if I put my clinical hat on, we understand that the psychological manifestations and issues are going to likely last much longer than actually the virus itself. And this is what some of my professional associations were talking about in my professional associations is how can we get out in front of some of this through education, by being able to assist in understanding, normalizing some of these behaviors and symptoms so that we can potentially stave off some of the mental health issues that actually potentially are going to happen. Now, we're already seeing a significant uptick in mental health issues. I need to unfortunately tell you that. There has already been an uptick nationally in mental health issues and mental health diagnosing. And so when we are thinking about flattening the psychological curve, you must think in terms as a leader in reducing anxiety for your staff and then increasing safety. So there is a clear correlation to reducing anxiety while you're increasing safety, which is not rocket science, right? That makes sense. So as we're talking, you know, as we're sort of going through some of this, you're going to see addressing sort of flattening the curve through those aspects specifically. What I'd love for you to do as I'm talking is if you have any like ideas, thoughts, comments, please put it in the chat. If you have questions, I'm going to stop every about 10, 15 minutes and also take any questions about the information that we're talking about now. So feel free, please. I believe that the more interactive through chat you can be, the likelihood that the experience actually will likely be somewhat different for you. So making sense, right? Flattening the psychological curve is the goal. Now in reentry, if we think about this, reentry in the workplace, and I want to define what reentry actually is, because reentry for some of you, you're already working in the workplace. You've been there the whole time, right? But there is, some have not, some have been home. But the point about reentry, and this is, by the way, reentry in our workplace, also reentry in our lives, if you think about this, for those of you who've been more homebound, is reentry means that there's going to be a change in the workplace. So I have many colleagues that go to work every day, but most of their colleagues have not been there. So they have been able to provide the necessary safety that they may feel they need. But when we start adding more of our colleagues, right, and more bodies, we start to know, we're going to start to see a difference potential in our sense of safety. So I want to go over this a moment just in terms of talking about some of the reentry challenges. And then we'll have a chance to go into greater depth as we go on. Also, we'll have a chance to discuss specifically some of the really ways when you're thinking of your planning, some real sort of concrete perspectives of the planning itself. So I keep getting asked, why are we having the responses and reactions that we're having? I don't know about you, this is my first pandemic, unless you're over 100 years old. You know, it's your first pandemic because the last one was in 1918. I actually know one person that was born in 1918, born in 1916 that is still living, but they don't remember the pandemic because they were too little. So I say this because I don't know if you feel this way, but I know that I certainly have experienced this. This pandemic has created issues and complexities that I've just never in my life thought about before. So obviously it starts with a virus, right? A virus. Okay, I'm more understanding a lot more about viruses now and the power of viruses and the life of viruses. And nonetheless, most of you will agree that illness and survival and the potential to become incredibly sick and potentially die has been at the forefront of some of the fear, right? Some of us are carriers, will be carriers. Some of us will actually become ill. Smaller percentage of us will actually become ill. Even a smaller percentage of us will die. Some of us, as we know, are in a higher, we're in a higher risk groups. Others are in a lower risk group. All of that is sort of taken into account when we think about illness and survival. But here's the most unique piece that I have ever experienced. Do you guys realize that every other person besides ourselves potentially could harm us? Now, I say that because that's stunning to me. Even the people we love, even the people that we are close to, that we trust implicitly, potentially could harm us during this virus, if in fact they're carrying it or they get ill. So if you think about that for a moment, how unique is that experience? I know that most of us view certain people, right, that we may describe as unhealthy for us or maybe even dangerous for us, all of that. But in this case, it's every other person. Now, that has been one of the most stunning aspects of and challenging and complex aspects. And you guys know that for those of you who have not been seeing your family members because you're afraid potentially to get them ill, or they're afraid they'll get you ill. Personally, I've hardly seen my son in 9 weeks, and usually he doesn't live here. He lives an hour from us, and usually we are together all the time. And he will come by in a mask, stand outside still, and you know, we keep talking about how can we re-enter? How can we re-enter? I mean, it's really on some level really has created some grief and loss experiences for people as well. I feel very badly for those that have their caregiving responsibilities where they really can't even caregive in the way they need. Or if you've had sick relatives who've ended up in the hospital where you can't actually even be there to support them. So other people is another complexity. Resources are certainly have been an issue all along. And then interfacing. What do I mean by interfacing? What we're seeing is something that in my organization we're calling interfacing anxiety. At this stage, right, we know that interfacing with other individuals, interfacing potentially with even groceries could potentially, right, get us create the virus. Where we would get the virus. So I say that because interfacing has become an incredibly stressful experience. Not to mention, then we create other complexities like layoffs. Financial, people have been affected financially tremendously. Lifestyles have been upended. You know, one part of the lifestyles that I believe has been probably one of the most difficult, and I know certainly I've experienced this personally too, is that I've lost my village. You know, we don't really communicate that much with our neighbors as we usually do. I don't go to see family as I usually would. For those of you who have children in school, you know, the schools are our village, our extended families are our village. I mean, you know, all of our village we now have sort of lost. So there's a real issue in that. And of course, then we have sort of this future, and the future includes, obviously part of the future now includes a successful reentry, or as successful as we can make it. Health and well-being is now a significant front-facing issue for staff. Our goal, I'm sure you wouldn't disagree, is keeping our staff healthy and well, just as it is for you to keep yourself healthy and well. So we're looking at that challenge because suddenly this virus is creating more complications in order to do that. Also, there's a level of mistrust in whether or not the environment itself will be the safety that the staff, every individual staff might need. And of course, then the question is what is a new normal, or is there no normal? Like what is normal now? Most of us are not even sure how to define what normal is now. And we're not sure that we will ever go back to what we had before. I'm going to predict that for a very, very long time, we will need to stay vigilant around our own health and well-being. So I'm going to stop for a moment and just ask if there's any interesting comments, Georgia, or any interesting thoughts or questions at this point.
Yes, well, Teresa Wald made a comment. She said that we have all lost our village. So concerned for my family who live alone, like my elderly aunt and my sister battling cancer. And then we have Judy Gundy. She has her hand up. And I will see if there's a feature. Oh, I can't let her talk. Sorry. Well, that was the one comment in the discussion.
Unfortunately, we can't talk. Also, I unfortunately we can't talk, but please feel free to write in the chat. This is a webinar process, so this one you can't access.
We have a couple more people also making similar comments about losing a village or losing that sense of community.
Yes, you know, it's sort of interesting, Georgia, in that way. The fact of losing the community is so gigantic. And then on top of that, now as we re-enter our communities, many of us are really scared and suspicious of the community. So it's not even like, oh, great, okay, we had to miss our community and now we're just heading right back in, right? So that in itself, the compromises that exist or the fear that exists is palpable.
Yes, very true. Yeah, reentry is definitely a very difficult part of this whole pandemic and everything that's going on, for sure.
And, yeah, any other thoughts, comments? Otherwise, I'll go on and we'll get more.
Let's see, one person just put, yes, people just again, reiterating what we've been saying.
Okay, all right, so then let me move on and I will, I'll come back to you again to ask. And if something really, you know, if you need, remember to just interrupt me. So I want us to look at the spectrum of return to work psychosocial impacts. For those of you who've taken my class before around the psychological impacts of the pandemic, you're going to notice some similarities and you're going to notice some differences in terms of what we went over before. So, of course, some of the things you might notice that aren't going to surprise you, and please, as you're looking at this list, please see what it is that you may relate to, because there are some real similarities that people are already reporting. So not surprisingly, there's still anxiety, fear, and worry. It's not surprising. There's certainly, and remember, we're looking at these are some psychosocial impacts. We have some and responses. So some are looking at sort of their compliance, right, and this desire to be compliant. Others are talking about sort of their not understanding why there's a need to be compliant. Certainly we're seeing bias, unfortunately, and that's, as I say, that's unfortunate. Some people have shame still around, you know, sort of which side it is that they're on. We're going to talk about some of the binary aspects that are going on here and why people are sort of divisive right now, why they're taking sides. We'll talk about that in a little bit. There's many that feel invulnerable, which is I guess this was a pandemic that didn't involve other people. That invulnerability, I understand completely, but unfortunately, that invulnerability does not necessarily translate well to others, so it can still create anxiety. Pandemic politics, it's a sad state of affairs to me that we actually have a political piece to this pandemic. Given that it's really is a scientific medical issue. Some are feeling alienated. FOMO, I've been hearing a number of staff talking about this fear of missing out, especially for those who feel like they are really don't have the health to re-enter. So they have really great fear of missing out in terms of, if I'm not in the office, what will work be like for me? Will I be only one of the few? Some are refusing to go back to the office, while some are very excited to sort of re-enter whatever that looks like in their re-entry. We also have, I'm going to talk about what it is to be calculating and safe netting. We're going to talk about safe netting in a little bit. Also, some are coming back, guys, very well adjusted. They have been adaptive. They've been able to manage what they need to, and they are coming back in an adjustment state. Others are coming back in a maladjusted state, and there's a spectrum on that. right? So some are coming back actually with actual diagnoses, new diagnoses, mental health, physical diagnoses. And I'll talk to you why that is. Our bodies are not meant to stay in the level, or our minds in the level of vigilance, psychological and physical vigilance that we've been experiencing. So quite often people will start to get ill, unfortunately. Some people are really relieved. I've talked to some of our health and human service professionals that just can't wait to kind of get back to some level of normalcy. Others are having a grief response. Many have health concerns and needs. Many have health concerns and needs, and they're stating it and they're talking about it. And also the distrust, which I mentioned before, is also quite palpable. And what staff are talking about around distrust is this concern: will my agency create an environment that really can keep me healthy? And of course, there's always pre-existing conditions, unfortunately, that some of us have. And there can be exacerbations in that. In other words, there can be a triggering of medical conditions as a result of the stress that people have been under, and the concerns, and potentially even if they've been physically ill from the virus itself, some are still healing, as well as mental health issues and trauma and trauma issues. I want to mention trauma for a moment. Many of us that go into these fields have histories of trauma, whether it is history of childhood trauma, which we call attachment trauma, whether it is histories of acute traumas, where there have been traumas in adulthood or before, where a critical incident in which we were involved in. So many of us have histories of trauma. And during times like this, I need you to know that we are at a higher likelihood to have what we call trauma triggers, a triggering in our trauma, which can exacerbate if you have a history of PTSD, if you have a history of anxiety, all of that depression, all of that can potentially be exacerbated. I've offered this down here. This is called the Coronavirus Anxiety Book. I would recommend all of you download it. I think this actually, when you get this, it might be a live link, which you'll all get this PowerPoint. But I recommend that you take a look at the Coronavirus Anxiety Book. It is actually very, very, very well written, very well written. So, after talking about some responses, we have been keeping, in my office, we've been keeping poll data, and we actually call it mining poll data, which means that we are looking week after week on so far we're at our 10th week this week, but I want to know, and we've been specifically mining the data off of this question: what reactions have you been experiencing? What reactions have you been experiencing? And then I'll have a chance to talk, and you please feel free to answer as you go. Fear, anxiety, overwhelm, worry, hypervigilance, exhaustion, sleep difficulty, focus, productivity difficulties, sad, depressed, isolated, hopeless, helpless, anger, frustration, irritability, and none of the above. And feel free to answer. This is great. We've got almost 40%. In order for me to use the data, I need 80%. So if you guys don't mind, even if you don't like usually answering polls, if you would gift me that, I would be greatly indebted, because I actually use these polls, and we're using them to provide leadership across the country to understand. I've spoken to, as of the end of this week, I will probably speak to almost 7,000 individuals. And so these are all health and human service professionals, and public service professionals. So it's kind of cuts across both public service itself, and many are health and human services. All right, what are we at? Oh, we're at 84%. Oh, thank you guys so much. Okay, let's give it another 10 seconds. I've got 86%. This is awesome. And I'll then discuss with you the results.
Hey, Beth, this is Nancy. I also think that there might be a way to allow somebody to talk, a participant. So if you had room and could allow for a live question, we could potentially do that.
Okay, and so you know what I think, Nancy?
Yep.
Why don't we see what we have at the end, our time at the end?
Okay.
So that would be great.
Great, we'll do.
Thank you. Thanks, Nancy.
Yep.
So you can close at 87%. Awesome. So this data can definitely be used. So take a look, guys. So this is pretty standard on what we're seeing nationally, and I'll show you some of our poll data in a moment, national poll data. So as you see, for those of you out there, 57% are reporting fear, anxiety, overwhelm, worry, hypervigilance. We have seen an exhaustion, sleep difficulty, and focus productivity difficulty has increased steadily over the last 9 weeks. At your 10th week, we're up to 53 and 49%, meaning that in the first couple of weeks, you're going to see that that was pretty low. People still had energy, even though they were, the anxiety was incredibly high. Depressed mood has been increasing, as well as a significant increase in anger, irritability, 31, 35%. And then, of course, we have some that are having none of the above, and I thank you for responding to that. All right, so I'm going to close this poll. There we go. So I want to talk with you a little bit about some of the national data that we've been collecting at Organizational Mind Group, which is the corporation that I work for and with. Take a look at this, guys. So if you take a look at this, these are the weeks 1 through 9. You guys are now in the 10th week of my presentations and having the opportunity to create and mine the data on my data collection. So if you take a look, you remember, looks like there's a spelling error. You'll look at anxiety and fear, right, is here, which is the anxiety, fear, includes worry and hypervigilance, as it said. I had to shorten them, unfortunately. Exhaustion, sleep, reduction in focus, productivity, sad, depressed, and then that anger, irritability. Take a look, guys, over a 9-week period of time. So we see, right, that obviously anxiety was incredibly high in the beginning. At one point during my 2nd week, actually 80% of the respondents were saying that they were actually experiencing anxiety. But if we take a look, most of that has not gone below 70% over the last 9 weeks. Has not gone below 70%. Okay. Now, with that, though, the first couple weeks, if you take a look at sleep and exhaustion, as well as difficulty with focusing and productivity, that was relatively low in the 20%, 20%, 25% of the respondents were reporting. As the weeks went on, this peaked. Take a look at this. It peaked on the 5th week, actually. People were starting to report how exhausted they were. I remember in my 5th week, I was feeling absolutely exhausted. It was the process of just sort of doing my day was absolutely stunningly more difficult. I was noticing with that, though, an increase as we went with in the yellow, if you look, an increase in the sleep and exhaustion, and then an increase in productivity and in productivity and focus issues. So if you are in any way feeling like you notice that it takes you longer to get your work done, if you notice, for me, I'm finally at the place where it's not taking me almost double the time to do whatever project I'm doing. It was taking me double the time. That in itself was exhausting. Things that I would usually be able to complete without much energy at all were all of a sudden taking energy. You guys will have to let me know if you experience that as well. I'm hoping I'm not alone in it, but that's what's my experience. Here's the piece that is also has concerned us, and that is that if you take a look, the first couple weeks, you could see that anger and irritability and sadness and depressed mood, right? And remember, sadness and depressed also included isolation, right? Hopelessness, helplessness. Those were the sort of descriptors in the poll you just took. Thank you. These have also increased over the weeks, right? Now, what's sort of interesting to me in terms of this increase is that on week 9, okay, week 9, we started to see an even larger pop up in week 9, which was last week. And I'm actually wondering if part of that has also been that we've now added the cultural unrest as a result of Mr. Floyd's death. And so I'm wondering if we're going to see actually a steady increase. I won't know that yet, but there certainly is a significant increase in anger and irritability that people are reporting. They did report last week. So I don't know if you have any questions on this. Please feel free to ask. I can tell you why this information is important and why it is that I've been providing this data and have been asked to provide this data to a number of agencies, including some federal leaders, is because it's so important for us to understand and know what is actually going on, right? Specifically with our workforce. So I want you to think about in terms of how are our workforce returning, right? Now, these are your responses. But what's been really interesting is we ended up merging leader responses with staff responses in order to take our data because they were no different. They were absolutely no different. It was fascinating in terms of the similarities. So we had decided to merge them. So this represents leaders, supervisors, managers, staff, even elected officials have been on. All of this data represents that. So any questions, thoughts before? I want to make sure I...
Yes, there was one question. There are a couple questions. So,
oh, great. I like questions.
What date was week 1?
Oh, thank you. Week 1 was the first week of April.
Perfect. Also, somebody had asked a little while ago, how do we deal with compound non-normalcy that is getting worse as time goes by?
Oh, that's a great question. Boy, that's a complex question. You know, when I start to, because Georgia, I'm going to go over some of the, what happens sort of in our brains during this time and what happens to our nervous systems. And I hope I'll be able to address that more because we as human beings don't deal well with excessive uncertainty. We are not wired to tolerate excessive uncertainty for a long period of time, which is why eventually people actually can end up getting ill. So if my colleague that asked that question doesn't mind if they wait for a moment, I will address that in a couple more slides.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a couple comments too. One person said that that they developed a routine at home so as not to become depressed, such as walking in the morning and evenings.
Yes.
That's great. And then another comment is that it will be interesting to see if there's a way to compartmentalize the effects of COVID-19 and the more recent civil unrest.
Yes, that's a really great question, and I don't know fully how to compartmentalize that because many of us already are. All of this is going on when we were already in a compromised emotional, for many of us, in psychological state. So I'm not sure the best way of compartmentalizing. What I can tell you though is self-care is absolutely imperative during this time. It's self-care. It means we have to, most of us in our public service industry, we like to be outside. We are looking outward to help other people. It's one of the reasons why we go into these businesses, because we want to be outside helping other people. And yet during this time, we really do have to change our beacon a little bit and be able to help ourselves, especially if we're going to tolerate sort of all this uncertainty and all the changes that are going on and the inability to predict. A lot of us, we cannot predict our future right now, which is also very stressful. So I say that because for those of you that sort of feel guilty or uncomfortable or don't feel like you deserve to take good care of yourself because so many other people need you or are also having a difficult time, I'm going to ask you to really reevaluate that. Really reevaluate that because we need, and someone was saying about walking, I'm a big one who supports mindfulness practices because, and I'll talk to you about that when I'm talking about the neuroscience, really allows ourselves to calm our nervous system. It can really turn off some of those fear thoughts that we have. I recommend people use distraction, use anything you can, socialization. You know, many people, and I don't know if you've seen this, Georgia, in your in sort of with your friends and stuff, but many people used social distancing in the term to not be social at all. I actually have been very vocal about this, and I've got some counties and states that are really calling it physical distancing because it is not social distancing, it's physical distancing. We can still be social. We just have to stay away and far away from people. We can still be social, right? We can still be social virtually. We can do the amount of isolation is stunning right now. It is unhealthy. Human beings are built to socialize. We are built to be social, and to withdraw or to take that away really does create some emotional upheaval.
Yes, it really does.
Yeah. So anything else that, or I'll go on and we'll connect in a little bit.
That was pretty, yeah, you can go on.
Okay, that sounds great. So I want us to talk about this time and what it means to be addressing problems versus solving them. Now, I know that for those of you that are in this work, I know that most of you totally understand addressing problems versus solving them. Just in terms when I think about the pure out complexity of being able to solve something in our communities like homelessness or food insecurity or all of these sort of large issues. Today we're even looking at, racial inequities again. I mean, we're over and over again, right? How do we solve see these issues? So I understand that many of us know about the problem addressing versus solving. But in this case, with reentry, we are looking at a fairness to you, those of you that are trying to make decisions around how you're going to reenter. I need to tell you that you are not going to do this perfectly. And we don't even know what solving would look like because information keeps coming out differently every day. We end up, kind of starting one course and then something new will come out, which will move us to another course. It's one of the reasons why I say as a leader, if you're not being adaptive during this time, you're going to have such a more difficult time than if you're able to allow yourself to be adaptive. You're able to allow yourself to pivot when something new, if new science comes out, if new CDC regulations, if our governor decides something different, it's vital right now to be adaptive. It's vital. So let me talk to you a little bit about one thing that I know though, is that information reduces anxiety. Now, many of you and many people say to me, yes, Beth, but I don't know if I'm even giving accurate information. The only information that you can provide right now is the information that you've been told and we've been told. But one of the problems we have also is that who is to be trusted with information? Well, that is a unusual, in my opinion, experience when it comes to science. Not when it comes to other things, but when it comes to science. Even right now, we're not sure which scientists and which science organizations to trust. So that's something that we all have to be able to decide ourselves. And as an agency, right, whose information are we going to use? When you do that, communication is another piece. Those agencies that are communicating regularly, having their leadership communicate regularly, those agencies that are communicating and they're communicating in a way that's not that is always allowing for renegotiation of the communications, right? Because we know that we can't necessarily guarantee that what it is being communicated won't change. And I recommend actually a disclaimer on every communication. At this time, this is what based on what we know, this is our best communication that we can provide you, right? Some agencies are not communicating well at all. They really aren't. They're having a hard time knowing what to communicate. And my recommendation is it would even be better to communicate that you guys are in the process of planning what to communicate than not to communicate at all. The information reduces anxiety. We also need to look at, from the problem addressing side, is protective strategies and actions. And I say that because this is a very difficult, more complex aspect. It's a more physical health aspect, as we know. But all of it we want to look at is how is it that we work toward calming our calming nervous system, calming anxiety is to calm our own physiology, our own nervous system. So let me talk to you a little bit more about what that looks like. So let me do a quick neuroscience lesson, and probably I'm hoping this will make more sense. For those of you who don't like neuroscience, I apologize. I promise you I won't take long. So this is what we call the threatened brain model. This is a simplistic model of your brain. I am going to cut it, as you may notice, I've cut it into 3 specific parts. We've cut it into the neocortex. We're going to look at the limbic system, and we're going to look at the reptilian brain. And I'm going to look at it for you from a perspective of not just how it is we think, but what happens in our bodies as well. What is the physiology when we have, and how is it that and what is the emotional states that we end up experiencing? So I'll go and I'll explain it. And then please ask any questions that you might have or make comments if you'd like. So the part of our brain that is in the neocortex, actually our neocortex makes up the largest part of our brain. Neocortex means new brain. So that also from an evolutionary perspective is the newest part of the human brain is the neocortex. It is that part of our brain that is able to be rational, to be able to think. We actually call it the wisdom part of our brain because it doesn't have our emotional centers overrunning our brain when information comes in. So what do I mean by that? When information comes in through our senses, whether it's our eyes, our ears, our nose, whether it's touch, right? It's kinesthetic or it's taste. Information comes into our senses. And if information that comes into our senses does not have a lot of emotion around it, it will come in through and it will travel up here into our brain, right? Into the neocortex area, up into where we call the wise brain. Right here, I've called this wisdom. Right there where we're above in the neocortex side, because the wisdom in our brain is this: we are able to make decisions when most of the oxygen and glucose is running around that side of our brain. We have oxygen and glucose running around our whole brain at all times. And when it's what we call top-down management, when that is on top and it's operative, we are able to make decisions, we're able to think logically, we're able to take a lot of information in, we're able to do good planning, all of those things we need to be able to make decisions that will have value and hopefully will be strategic and important. Now, we have another part of our brain and it's called the limbic system. The limbic system is much smaller. It's right here and you can see it. It's right, actually, the limbic system is so small, but it's that it's actually fueling right now. And why do I have this lit up? I have it lit up, guys, because this is the part many of us right now are living in. And what happens for some of us is we are going back and forth from our wise brain to our fear centers, back and forth. It's actually where we take in our threats and we take in our traumas. So if we are witnessing with our eyes, our ears, our nose, our mouth, whatever, taste, feel, if we are witnessing something that actually has tremendous amount of emotion in it, fear in it specifically, right? It will trigger off the oxygen and glucose will leave this side of our brain and it will move down to the limbic area. And the limbic area is much smaller, but nonetheless, it can wreak havoc for us. When our limbic part of our brain is triggered, it will also kick off automatically our reptilian brain, which is the oldest part of our brain. For those of you who like anthropology, you'd be fascinated actually by understanding just brain development itself. So what is this part of the brain? This is where we experience I'm going to freeze. Our bodies immediately will go into a freeze, flight, or freeze, flight, or fight mode. Those three: freeze, flight, or fight mode. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that our bodies will get ready to take care of some sort of a threat. It could be a tiger coming in, okay? But unfortunately, the virus is not a tiger. We can't see the threat. This one is invisible, and it's sort of lurking for us, and we are staying in what we call a hypervigilant state. So let's talk about the cognitive. What happens cognitively? What happens cognitively is that if we stay in this sort of a more threatened state, it interrupts our ability to focus, concentrate, produce, think clearly. I'll say it again. If we are staying in this sort of state, it will interrupt our ability to focus, be productive, to think clearly, to even sometimes make decisions. It'll also create absolutely exhaustion. Why it creates exhaustion is that when we are in this emotional feared center, sort of limbic and then reptilian brain state, we start secreting a tremendous amount of the stress hormone called neurochemical called cortisol, which is a stress hormone, as well as adrenaline kicks in on us. We actually, without the fact that we're even going to be running a mile, we are going to have adrenaline that's sitting inside our body because our bodies are getting ready to fight, freeze, or flee, even though we don't have right now a real visible threat. I hope that makes sense to everyone. So what happens then our bodies? When our bodies are sort of become vigilant, our bodies, we get the physiological responses, right, are that we will start to sweat. We will start to, our stomach sometimes will get nauseous. We'll digest food very quickly. We will sweat. We will feel sort of extra energy. All of that adrenaline will sort of crowd into our body just in case a tiger, and we can see the tiger that we have to fight, freeze, or flee. And we will stay, if it's a chronic threat, we will stay in a chronic vigilant state. Our bodies will. Now, there's two sides of our nervous system. When we think of physiology, there's a sympathetic nervous system, and then there's something called the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system we need if our survival is actually being threatened, and we see that threat and we want to run or do whatever we need, fight. Another side is called the parasympathetic nervous system state. We need that state specifically because that's where our body rests, heals, it gets balanced, it gets nourished, and it's really where our body can it's sort of let down. So I know that many of you reported, noticing problems in sleep. Part of the reason that we're having trouble with sleeping right now is because of this process. We are having trouble sleeping because once we have this threat that is invisible and we detect it, it creates our limbic activation, which gets our mind and our body ready. We are prepped for some kind of a battle that we can't fight because we can't even see the battle. We can't see the enemy. It's invisible. I hope that makes sense. So then those stress hormones are released, and that's why many of us are not feeling very well. A lot of people that I talk to are just talking about this sort of level of emotional dysregulation where they just don't feel like they are as emotionally level as they're used to being. Also, what happens, which is very important during this time, is that in a limbic state, activated state, we start to think very black or white. We start to think very binary. Something's right, something's wrong. Everything's sort of, it's good or it's bad. It creates a great amount of our own internal divisive way of thinking. They're okay, they're not okay. So I say that because I'm hoping that it creates some context in terms of this. Any questions specifically around this information, Georgia?
I don't see it. Nothing's come up yet.
All right, well, that's good.
I'm explaining it.
All right, good. So I want us to move on for a moment because this is a great segue actually into why it is that we need to be workforce trauma informed. Now, many of you who work in social services, behavioral health, some of the other parts of HSA, you already know about trauma-informed practices because you're already using trauma-informed practices in your communities, right? For your clients, for your community members. So being workforce trauma-informed merely means, for those of you that don't sort of hang out in a trauma-informed practice mode, it merely means that we have to make some assumptions that at this time, many of our workforce actually are experiencing levels of stress, possibly even traumatic stress, that are going to drive some of their actions, some of their responses, some of their decisions. So I'll say that again. Being workforce trauma informed means that we, and especially during reentry, that you likely are going to see some of your colleagues, some of your staff, who you know to be a certain way, and they may have changed some. And what I say that is that they may be feeling differently than they did when they left the office. Now think about this for a moment in terms of reentry. Weren't most of us told 9, maybe 10 weeks ago that the offices we were in were no longer safe and we needed to leave? And we needed to leave immediately, right? So many of us stayed home and started to work from home and quickly created all that we're doing virtually, all that we're doing because our offices were unsafe. Those are the same offices, by the way, that we're now going to ask our staff to come back to. But remember, their last memory of that office was that it was unsafe. It was so unsafe that you asked them to leave. Some people have even closed down their offices completely. Others have kept their offices open, but they kept it with sort of a skeleton crew, right, that worked out of the office, right, but that they could stay socially distant, physically distant, and they could work. So I say this because, just in that way, it might not that may not compute so much because our office actually became a trauma trigger. Working together with all of us actually became a trauma trigger. I did my final presentation that I did in person was in Oakland. And I was with a large group of actually wonderful, wonderful state employees. They were awesome. And we had an awesome day. And then I realized as I was leaving that suddenly everyone was starting to talk about closing offices, closing this, closing that. And I realized, I started immediately thinking, oh my goodness, that room was incredibly tight. And I was separated, but I was really concerned for my colleagues, guys. They were sitting really close together. We were in too small of a room with more than we expected, participants than they expected. And we made it work. It was an all-day training. And I immediately thought to myself, for the first time ever, I'm wondering who might have gotten sick during that time. I didn't think I did because I know I was sort of on a stage, but I just saying that because it was like the first time I would have ever thought we were all together and someone might in that room have been sick. I know that must have gone through your minds as well. So let's talk about workforce trauma informed during reentry in terms of just this process. So one is obviously important is the awareness of what kind of pandemic trauma may have gone on. And when I say trauma, it doesn't mean someone needs to be fully blown post-traumatic stress disorder. It's just the fact that there has been, that people have been in a threatened, very, very uncomfortable state. And then what are how careful can you be in terms of making sure that you don't, in your decision-making or as you're bringing back people, not to re-traumatize? This is a time where I'm recommending you lead staff as well as serve staff. In other words, the conversations that you might have with staff today may have been very different than you would have pre-pandemic. This is a time actually where those leaders who tend to be sort of understand emotional intelligence will probably have an easier time with it than those of us that just don't work in that. We might be more task-oriented versus people-oriented. That's not a judgment, by the way. There's no judgment around that. We need our task-oriented leaders and we need our people-oriented leaders. But I say this because for those people-oriented leaders, likely you might find it somewhat easier. Because this is a time where not only do we need to feel empathy, which is, and most everybody feels empathy, we need to be able to express empathy. We need to be able to provide reflections or what we call mirroring back what people might be experiencing or feeling. This is not a time to be judgmental or tell someone they're wrong the way they're feeling, because the truth is that this is the people's experience, right? And the experience is going to be so variable that frankly, I'm a little concerned that it will exceed some managers and supervisors' capability, because you guys have never had to deal with this level of psychological distress. And in itself, we have to assume that most are returning with some level, not necessarily high levels, but some level of emotional or psychological experience at least. This is a time to be asking people questions. It's a time to be not only providing support, which most of us do, but also providing direction from a psychological perspective as well, not just from the physical safety side. Although I want to say this, remember flattening the psychological curve. Flattening the psychological curve is the more that you can provide safety, the more you, both psychological and physical safety, the more we decrease those levels of vigilance and anxiety. Now, for those that still decide to stay working from home or not in the office, there's this virtual presence. We need to understand as well is that, yes, people need social connection. If we have some back in the office, some are going to stagger their workplaces. Others are trying to figure out how to phase in employees as you're potentially changing how your offices are set up. But the social connection is always important. Now, some people have said to me they have not been so social as they have been since we've been using the virtual platforms, which I kind of find funny because I feel the same way. I've seen more people over the last 10 weeks than I have in a long time because I'm on the virtual platform so much. Also, you need to understand in terms of those that return and don't return, there's a level of inclusion, exclusion that some people might be feeling. Remember I talked about that fear of missing out. So that may be, and also there many are talking about the virtual platforms and just a burnout around and exhaustion and fatigue around being on virtual platforms hour after hour after hour. Now, It's definitely the best game in town, but it's a game that's tiring people. Although I have to tell you, from a personal perspective, I have several friends who have lost their jobs. And when I was talking about virtual fatigue, two of them looked at me and said, I'll take virtual fatigue if I had a job, so stop complaining. So I said, okay, you're right. So it's all relative. We know about this merger between personal life and professional life. You have, and you may be asking staff to come back, and you might be asking staff to come back who still have the children at home, or have caregiving responsibilities that they didn't usually have. So we need to understand that while personal life is still merging with professional lives, that creates real, and we not necessarily have our village, right? That will create additional stressors, significantly different stressors. And I'll tell you what my wish list is. If you guys don't mind, I'll tell you a wish list. And I actually said this to an agency in Pennsylvania. They're in one of the big cities, so their offices are on the 28th floor. By the time they would do a reentry to work, and they could get everybody up on the 4 elevators, thinking that only one person could be in the elevators, or 2 people could go in the elevators and get 6 feet apart, it would take half the day to get their staff up, and then the other half the day to get the staff down on the elevators alone. So they were not planning on opening their office, and they're not planning on opening it for quite a long time. And they figured out how to do their work virtually. And fortunately, part of their office has call centers, so that has been okay. And so I say this because I jokingly said to them, well, great, if you're not going to go back and you don't need to for your own business needs, right, for your business model, then you're just going to watch everybody, what mistakes and errors they make, and you'll be so informed by the time you decide to go back. It'll probably be pretty unremarkable. And I said that jokingly, but I actually realized I wasn't joking. For those agencies that are willing to slow their process down some of you may already be doing this. Those agencies are willing to slow their process down we actually can get a lot of lessons learned from things that work and don't work from other agencies. And not that it's exactly like for like, but it may very well be similar enough to help in decision making and inform. Obviously, part of being let me go back to sort of a trauma-informed perspective. It's always about giving referrals, either internal, external referrals. EAPs are the counseling, usually EAPs are employee assistance programs, which provide confidential counseling. Usually there's a number of sessions that people can have for free. But really having that information, if you see people in distress, because you may very well notice distress in some of your staff. And also, this piece is vitally important. So this is about modeling. And what do I mean about modeling? Modeling specifically is where it is that we see how is it that you as leaders can model a level of neutrality? Because remember, there's going to be a sort of a binary process, especially potentially around compliance versus non-compliance, binary process. Not only do you need to model neutrality and being adaptive, but people are going to be watching you to decide, is it really okay to take sick leave now? Because the truth is that for the first time ever, sick leave, in my opinion, has always been a badge that our health and human service professionals would wear and then not. They would come into the office sick. They would come into the office sometimes in states where, where they really should have been home. And many of you will probably agree too, that you've gone into the office. I know I have when I was ill, but we now know that that is not going to be an option. Actually, that will be an option that would most definitely raise the curve, and we don't want that. So even modeling things down to making sure that if you're not feeling well, that you are able to express that and say, you know what, I'm not coming in today because I'm not feeling that well and I'm going to stay home. So I say that because you're modeling what is behaviors that you're needing to see is going to be absolutely, absolutely non-negotiable if you want your staff to come back and experience some sense of well-being. You will need to model that, because the issue of conformity is gigantic. People conform, especially to their leaders. People conform based in our own social, our own, sort of our own social group. Let me give you an example. I'll play a quick video here. And now, I don't know if any of you know about the pink hairnet experiment, but this is called the pink hairnet experiment. And some of it might be unbelievable to you, but let's watch it. So it's pretty amazing to me about the degree of how people will follow a leader. And this person wasn't even they weren't a leader, in their lives. So please understand, as you're being leaders, your staff are going to be looking toward you, to decide what you really mean. And they're going to look at your behavior, not what it is you're saying, to really understand what it is that's expected of them. It's just how we're wired. So I want to throw up this last poll. What do staff need most to readjust to the workplace? And please choose the top 2. And Georgia, if you want to pop it up, that'd be great. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. You're so timely. So please feel free to answer. Please pick your top 2. I know all of them have relevance. And this information is really important because I'm trying to offer and be able to provide some feedback now as we're doing these reentries. I talk to a lot of counties and state agencies around these issues, and nonprofits actually as well. Great, we're already 44%. If anybody doesn't mind, if we can give me 80, I can use it to use as data. Appreciate 80%. What are we up to? 60%? Awesome. Oh, you guys are really helpful. I want to thank you already. Awesome. We're at 72. We only need a few more. So close. 78. 70. Yes, 80. Great. So let's take about 15 seconds and give anyone else a chance to answer. And I want to thank you for answering. And then we'll talk about the results. All right, so if you guys want to see the winner, which I don't know if any of these are actually winners, but if you looking at the polling results, strong leadership messaging, modeling, and communications really came up 70%, that those of you that responded are seeing that is a vitally important. And as I said earlier, I will be in complete agreement with you. And the truth is that, here's my experience. Some leaders this exceeds some leaders' capacity to be able to communicate about this. So I want to say this to you guys, and maybe it's inappropriate for me to say, but I will, is that sometimes we need ghostwriters to just help communicate what we need, and then we certainly have to sign off on it and agree, but sometimes we need writers to help us put some of these messages together, and then we put it on our email and we send it out. So I say that because I have a number of leaders that have said to me, Beth, if I knew how to say it, I would say it. I just don't know how to say this stuff. So let's take a look here. It looks like we have 53%, 55% office reentry arrangements, either working from home, options, staggered workday. What does that look like? Absolutely is a very much of a what they need in terms of and a concern, as well as physical safety measures are also. And of course, we have less here addressing client customer interfacing concerns. I have to tell you that I believe that this will increase when you're actually back. I believe it will increase when you're actually back, because the truth is people are going to come out from the outside, and they are going to not necessarily be willing to either be compliant or to be able, or even coming in potentially ill. So depending on what PPE measures you're going to have, it really greatly will. And so I'm interested to see, as this happens, I think we might see this in this side of the addressing client and customer interfacing concerns go up. Maybe not. We will know eventually. So I thanks so much, George. I'm going to close that. I want to talk a little bit about, I don't know if those of you that have been working in the EOCs in your county, the Emergency Operation Command Centers, you probably know this hierarchy of controls. This is actually the physical hierarchy of controls. It's really a hierarchy that CDC NIOSH put out a number of years ago around, if you have some kind of a physical hazard, what do you do? So I'll just say real quickly, you know, obviously the most effective way of dealing with any physical hazard would be to eliminate it, or, and even potentially if we can't eliminate it, we want to create some kind of a substitution, right? So that in its fact, it's not going to be as hazardous, potentially as hazardous physically to us. If we can't do that, so this is on a continuum. If we can't do that, those that are less effective but still somewhat can help, what we will do, right, is we will isolate people from the hazard. So think about this in terms of the pandemic, right? We've isolated people from the hazard, the virus. We've created administrative controls, right? We've changed the way people work. And then, of course, we're protecting our workers with PPEs and anything else that we can, as much as possible, right? The distancing. Now, workplace arrangements that are going to have to change, or work office arrangements, so all of that. So I'm going to offer you, this is the hierarchy of control. I would assume it makes complete sense to you. If it doesn't, please ask questions or comment. I want to offer you now the psychological needs and what the hierarchy looks like from a psychological perspective. Now, I'm going to talk about it from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow, Abraham Maslow was a fantastic theorist, and he created this theory years ago. I believe it was in the early 70s. But this theory absolutely fits for the pandemic. So if we have, but we're going to go now from basic up, from up to down. Okay, so we're going to start out with, this pandemic most definitely has threatened people's survival, right? You know, even what it is we eat, we drink. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I was scared to go out to grocery stores, and we were washing food off for a long time before we would even eat it. Boxes, everything wouldn't even come into our house, because we have some of us are higher risk in my household. So I say this because basic survival needs, physiological needs have been threatened, right? As well as safety and security. So these are his 5 areas. And what Abraham Maslow says is that you need to have these taken care of in order to really experience sort of a level of love and belonging, to experience our growth of self-esteem, which would mean confidence and respect, you know, and then self-actualization, which is the ability to just be incredibly creative, being mindful, being in the moment, being able to really know yourself the best you can know yourself, really do that self-reflection that many of us like to do, so we just kind of can grow and create a nicer, healthier, happier life. Where are we right now from a psychological perspective and a social perspective? We are in the first 2. This is what's being threatened. This is where exactly we are. And this is where we are still with people re-entering the workplace. So think about this for a moment, guys. To me, this is very important, because if this is where we are in terms of re-entering the workplace, this means that people are still in basically a pretty threatened state. And they may not be able to think as clearly, right? May not be able to focus as much when they come back. They may not be as creative. We need to slowly move up this pyramid again, but the pandemic has put us in this state from a psychological perspective, just based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I want us to talk a little bit about some recommendations I have and I'll say this, it is a, not only is it a pleasure to have the opportunity to sit on and be a consultant to agencies that are trying to make these decisions about reentry decisions, but it's also an honor for me. I have a background not only in human resources and in risk management and occupational health services. I also have a large background in emergency operations command and emergency operations itself. So not to mention that I'm a trauma expert and a mass trauma expert. So it's been a great honor for me to be able to help counties and some state agencies actually, and even nonprofits. How can you, from a psychosocial planning perspective, what are the considerations? So these are some of the areas that we specifically talk about. First of all, we go back again to this phases, understanding impact, adaptivity, being adaptive, and then innovation. Many of us may not be in a fully innovation state, but many are right now. And these, by the way, are phases, but they don't necessarily go 1, 2, 3. We may be going all over the place with these phases because information keeps changing. So here's some of the recommendations that I'm hearing. Here's some of the issues that are coming up. Many agencies are looking at right now what's essential and non-essential departments that require reentry. In other words, they're looking at, do we potentially, based on our office space, we can't bring everybody back. So let's just look at those essential reentry staff versus the non-essential. And can we then stagger or wait or let some of the non-essentials even potentially change how it is that they do their work? In other words, there is a likelihood that we may end up with a larger number of people than you've ever had actually working remotely. And if it's not every day, it may be 2 days a week, 1 day a week, whatever that is. I mean, it could look all different ways. My recommendation is specific. My recommendation is that if you allow, there are a lot of staff that are really wanting to go back to work for whatever reasons based in their own personal life and their professional life. They want to go back to the office. And self-selection to have the right to go back into the office is very positive because people who are wanting to go back will enter in a much more positive mindset. They will enter also with a reduced sense of even necessarily anxiety because they're excited and they chose it. So how are we as human beings? The more autonomous, the more we are able to make choices for ourselves, sort of exercise our own free will, the more successful the process will be. That meaning that you are going to have individuals that are going to tell you that they will not enter. They may not even say to you, oh, I have a health condition that I can't come in. Or they might find a health condition to have or get a doctor's note, right? But I'm to get accommodations, but think very strategically about how it is that you want to plan reentry. Now, the other piece that I want us to talk about also is safety protections. The more safety protections you verbalize, the more you communicate safety protections, the more you're going to have it. And those systems need to be as clean and as productive as possible, because that will equal your staff's experience of you caring about their well-being. The safety protections that you create will equal the care that people will experience around their well-being. Now, I can say the opposite. If your safety protections aren't clear and you don't have enough and there's sort of, it's all confused and you're bringing people back and you're going to kind of learn as you go, I would recommend not doing that, because those lack of safety protections will increase anxiety and will increase threat and potentially be traumatizing, more traumatizing than some people may already be experiencing if they're experiencing traumatic stress. Compliance enforcement. This is an issue that I'm talking about in a lot of meetings. How do we enforce compliance based in whosever regulations you're going to use? We remember that we have some that actually don't feel that compliance is necessary. We have a very, very sort of binary process right now going on in the US, and some don't see the importance, others see the importance. And how do you make that decision in terms of for health and well-being around that? And then do you enforce, don't you enforce, and how do you enforce? And it's a hard one. Let me go over here for a moment. Adaptive communications. There are obviously being adaptive, communicating, as much as possible is important. We've already all decided that. And also looking at organizational cultural updates. You're going to end up, you have the potential here to be innovative and change the culture. Even our constituents that are in our communities will probably not be balking like they're usually balking about us wanting to change our public service cultures. We've proven, by the way, that you can still be productive and be not necessarily sitting in your seat at work. I recommend also being very aware of interface anxiety. What does that mean? And that, remember, interface anxiety is that people are interfacing. There's a level of anxiety around anything that people are interfacing, especially with their colleagues and their staff and their communities. So being able to sort of be sensitive to that interfacing anxiety. We look at what's called safety netting, I mentioned before. I didn't really talk about it very much. Some of your staff are not really at all sure how they're going to return. They're not sure what anything's going to look like. They're scared, they're concerned, and they're going to want to utilize potentially FMLA, workers' comp, disability, HR, some of the human resource stuff. I'm saying this because for those of you that know me, I've been very vocal about this. I'm very concerned if your human resources is not staffed well, or your your county council offices are not staffed well, because there's potential, or your risk managers, there's potential that you're going to get absolutely overwhelmed by staff's medical, psychological needs, and just want to be, and then of course, remember that the more that people are not experiencing that you care about their well-being, then the more we increase the chances of grievances and we increase the chances of complaints. So I am recommending, some of you know, when I've talked to you guys about this as well, I believe that this is a lot to ask for managers and supervisors as staff are reentering, and we're reentering the workplace in this new way. I do believe that managers and supervisors need some kind of transition training, which would include even just how to manage some of the psychological, emotional, social questions, issues that are going to come up. None of us guys were trained. I mean, as a psychologist, I obviously was trained probably more than most, but none of us who are doing this work have been trained in this kind of stuff. This is new. This is a really new experience. And then of course, offering debriefings if we need. Debriefings are merely facilitated conversations, usually from an outside facilitator who can come in and talk to people about how they're doing, how they're feeling, and just sort of being able to manage some of this stuff. Having an opportunity to talk about what happened when they were at home, or what happened when they were not in the office, whether they've had losses, whether they're grieving, all of that. The power of debriefings actually is that the more we talk about it, we unload it. And if we can unload some of this stuff, actually we will adjust better, and we will have less emotional baggage that we're carrying. And then of course, supports, resources, consultations, whatever it is that you need in your agencies that can help address the physical as well as the psychosocial these considerations. I'm gonna finish up here in a moment, and then we'll have about 6, 7 minutes maybe to ask questions or comments. So here's some of the checklists that I'm recommending. Empathize with fear and other emotions, normalize stress responses, communicate about the pandemic and the changes that you guys are making. Please try to promote a calm and a sense of protectiveness. While you're still trying to instill hope and sort of build back resilience, you might notice that people are not as resilient. They're not coming back as resilient. Even people that you've always seen as very, very resilient. Provide information as an antidote to anxiety. Establish new office cultural rituals. And please, please, please encourage self-care and help-seeking behaviors. I see this time, and any time when there's been catastrophe and when there's been critical incidences and hard times, I always see that there is also opportunity, some senses of opportunity. So I'm hoping that during this time, all of you can also, while you're dealing with some of these complexities and the difficulties, you can also keep asking yourself, what are the lessons learned? What post-traumatic growth can we create in both our staff as an individuals, in ourselves as well as as an agency. What opportunities can we leverage here? Boy, guys, you know, if bad things have to happen to us, we might as well grow from them. I mean, that is my belief. I've had that belief most of my entire adulthood. And I thank my mother actually for that, for providing me with that belief, is that we can't necessarily stop bad things from happening, but we sure have control over how we're going to manage it and then utilize what we've learned from it. So I don't think anybody will disagree with me on this. We are all pioneers right now, and we are navigating, and you're navigating uncharted territory. And we know that the destination is not clear. You're doing some map building here that is incredibly complex. I hope that you give yourself great amounts of self-compassion and compassion for your colleagues, as well as you're making some very, very difficult decisions. The compass isn't even going due north right now, and timelines are unclear, and we just need to have the ability to recalculate, be fluid, and give ourselves permission to not know, actually, and permission for those of you who like to know things and like to be right a lot. I'm not sure you'll be right as much as you're used to being. I want to provide you with some very, very powerful apps here that I'm recommending. There's a COVID coach out that that people are finding great, is very, very good, and I've gone through all of these. Healthy Minds is a great app to learn mindfulness practices, really learning how to calm your nervous system. From the University of Wisconsin in Madison. PTSD coach was created by the military, as well as the Provider Resilience app. This Provider Resilience app assesses burnout, and it helps you assess, and there's a lot of great things in this provider. All of these are free, by the way. So I recommend that you guys take a look at any of these or download them, see if they would help your staff as well as yourself. This app was created actually by a social worker, but the military took it and has adapted some of Bethlehem Stamp's information, and then has created a great app. Here are some other resources just that you guys will have an opportunity to have. And then this is a book that I wrote. This is called Work Aches, the Neuroscience Guide of Surviving and Thriving at Work. And this book, ironically, this book came out just a year ago. And the irony is that it is all about workplace and workforce trauma and what happens in health and human services and public service, actually. So it addresses specifically public service. All of these issues are discussed. We just go deeper in the book. So that's sort of a sad irony. Actually, we spent 3 years writing this book, Deborah and I, and we had never known that we would ever want to apply it to a pandemic. Any last thoughts, questions? We have 6 minutes, exactly what I hoped.
Yes, we have 2 questions.
Yes.
So one of them is, can you please offer practical steps to take in instances when leadership and staff have a wide gap in defining necessary safety protections?
Yes, well, I'll say a couple of things. One is that it's very important to appear impartial. So for our leaders to appear impartial and to not sort of get into this sort of what's right and what's wrong is vitally important. I also recommend that we empathize with those that also don't see the importance of complying with some of the PPEs, while other staff do see the importance. But at the end of the day, we have policies that are getting created. At the end of the day, we have protocols, and we're going to introduce new practices, and people need to follow them. So at the end of the day, even though there may be dichotomy, and it's one of the reasons I actually recommend even creating surveys and doing staff surveys. What do people feel like they need? I know a number of agencies that have done that, Georgia, but at the end of the day, it's our responsibility to follow policy.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I think that some of that gets easier once those policies are once those policies have been created.
Okay.
Other question?
Also, yes, the other question is, how do you calm folks down to understand they don't all need N95 masks?
Educate them. Pull up any of the information from any of those medical and scientific areas that you're using, whether it's the CDC, whether it's WHO, whether it is, and I would try to keep it much more medically oriented in terms of your decision making versus politically oriented. And I say that because even our governors are making great, I mean, many are using the medical perspectives, and they are sharing that, and they're telling us, and others aren't. And so to make sure that you keep it away as much from politics or your opinion versus being able to cite research right now. And the research will keep changing. That's what science is. That's what medical science is. Medical science is not because when someone changes, when you see new information around medical science, it's so important for us to be able to explain that's what science is. The more we learn about this virus, the more we will be able to then create changes in what's necessary. I no longer wash my food because I don't need to anymore. I now understand that more.
Okay, good. We have another couple questions that
Sure.
one of them is, I often feel like social service agencies talk about self-care and the importance of trauma-informed practices for their staff, but the actual practice of encouraging and providing space for both are lacking. What are practical ways agencies can account for both?
Such a great question. You know, that's a whole nother talk. That I give, Georgia. I talk a lot about secondary trauma and trauma-informed practices for workforce. I'll say a couple things. One is that I think that we today have a better chance of our agencies really looking at workforce trauma in a way that they never have before, because we have to make sure that we can help our communities. And if our staff aren't there or our staff aren't well, we're not going to be able to do that to help the communities. So number one, I think there's a greater awareness, certainly with the leaders that I speak to across the nation, of this importance to focus on you. That I can say right out the gate. I believe that there needs to be, and I recommend this at times, assessments around, and there are secondary trauma, trauma-informed assessments that can be used. And those agencies that do that, and they go department by department, are able to really look at how trauma-informed are we with our workforce. So you have to start with awareness, and then you need to be able to work with the culture and make a real commitment to workforce health and well-being. It has to be a commitment that starts, that comes throughout the agency, and it must start with senior leaders, and it must start even in counties with boards of supervisors or elected officials. Everybody needs to be on board.
Mm-hmm.
Other question?
Yes. What can we do to combat quarantine fatigue?
Oh boy.
Mm-hmm.
It is exhausting. I'm going to agree with whomever wrote that it is. I recommend, and I hate to sound really basic, but I will here, Georgia, I'm going to sound basic. You know, you need to eat right, you know, all the things that we know. We need to exercise. We need to be able to have some alone time, because some of that fatigue that people talk to me about is that they never get alone time anymore. Like sometimes guys, you know, my family are in another room here, but they don't think they'll hear me. But I'll tell you honestly, sometimes I go for a drive, or I'll go into the car and just sit in the car so I can have some alone time. So I say that because alone time is really important. We are not used to being with our families or whomever we're with 24/7. Or if you're alone, then you actually, and don't like that you feel that fatigue, quarantine fatigue, then you need to make sure that you're socializing more.
Mm-hmm.
But please use distraction, use mindfulness practices. For those of you who have never done mindfulness, this is the time to really choose to learn it. And it's so easy to learn. I teach thousands of employees all over the nation how to meditate and to use their breathing as a way to fortify themselves and to help build their resilience.
Mm-hmm. Another question that came up was, how do we ease workers that are being asked to come back to the office that aren't ready?
I think that, well, I'll tell you one thing is that for those that feel not ready, I would find out what they're not ready for, and why is it that what are their concerns, and how can we try to meet those needs. And some you'll be able to meet, and some you won't. Some you will need to meet based in what it is that you show them that you've created in the environment, and others are going to be paralyzed. So remember, we have fight, freeze, or flee. Some are going to be, they're going to freeze. They are not going to feel safe coming back. Others are just going to fight right back and go, yeah, I'm going to deal with this and I'll be fine. And then some, unfortunately, will even leave because, and I know a number of colleagues of mine that have decided that they're stepping out because they just don't want to do this anymore. And, you know, and they don't see that it's going to be a healthy or a reentry that would be what they need. So that would be my recommendation. And I know it's after 3. I want to be respectful of time.
Yeah, that's actually the last question. So.
Okay, perfect.
Perfect.
Oh, that was the last. Okay.
Mhm.
I want to thank all of you for coming on today. I know that you were willing to take 90 minutes out of your time. I hope that this information is helpful, at least to start thinking about how it is that you want to reenter. And I want to ask you all to please be safe out there, and to please focus on your own well-being as well. I know that doesn't come naturally to many of us in our industries, but please focus on your own well-being. We can't hear you, Nancy. Nancy, we can't hear you. Oh, there you are.
I was on mute, and I
know
said
you were
something
taking
incredibly
brilliant
profound.
stuff. I know you always do.
I know, it was really, and now I can't figure out, I can't recreate that profound thing, but I was thanking you. Thank you.
Thank you,
For
Beth.
spending your time and your, your thoughtfulness and how to help us move forward is so appreciated, because this is not easy stuff, and anything that you can offer is just incredibly, incredibly helpful.
Well, and thank you always for inviting me. I always appreciate it.
Yeah, and we will continue to invite you, Beth. We will continue to invite you. So we are recording this. This will be available for everybody to watch on the UC Davis website. We will send out links to everybody who's on right now, and you will be able to forward to all of your colleagues. And in addition, I'm sorry if I missed it, maybe you announced it, but we are doing another webinar in a couple of weeks on June 25th?
4th, I think.
4th. And did you mention that, Beth?
I'm not sure actually what date.
Okay.
So no, I did not mention it.
Great. On June 24th, we're going to do a follow-up webinar for staff on how to re-enter the workplace. So this one is for leaders, and then we'll do a follow-up for staff. And please invite your staff and let them know that this will be a resource for them to help them sort through all of these complex issues as they begin to consider re-entering.
Thanks again, guys, for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, Georgia. You did a great job proctoring.
Yeah, thanks, Georgia. It was fun to work with you.
You too.
Thanks everyone.